Hello, everyone. It feels just like I'm starting a podcast. So I was about to say welcome to another episode of the Share Your Story podcast. But this is a different presentation. This presentation is called Benefits of Grief. And I'd like to start off by thanking everyone that has made this possible. I found out about it in late January, I think. And here it is, end of April. And this conference has been amazing. So amazing. And I've learned so much from all of the presenters that I've attended. It would not be possible without the hands of our tech support, Chicken Fox Productions, Nate, Josh, and Ian. Amazing. A 3-person team doing incredible work. And Tony Lynch of Memories of Us, and Dee Bird with Unplugged Grief Ministries. Wow. This is amazing. And I am so excited to be here. And we're going to talk about the benefits of grief. So it's weird that I could be so passionate and excited about grief. Grief is not something that we usually associate with that. But anyways, let's get started. My name is Jenny Dilts, and I'm the founder. Like I said, I am the host of the podcast Share Your Story, exploring humanity one heart at a time. And I'm also the founder of Grieving Coach. And where I help people convert grief into growth. And I do that one conversation, one heart, one interaction, one step at a time. Throughout our time together, I encourage you to be open to any ideas that you might have for taking small, simple steps that will help you move forward in your own grief journey. And I also invite you to consider how you can share what you've learned in our time together with others. You might want to grab a pen. I know I sure have been taking a lot of notes. That's what I do. I take notes. So if you're like me, grab a pen and paper. Let's get ready to roll. If you're not a note taker, fantastic. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. I hope that Benefits of Grief will be a mix between presentation and conversation, where we'll talk openly about why we avoid grief, how society's perception of grief is often detrimental, and what we can do to build a positive relationship with grief. You are going to walk away with a notion that when we have a healthy relationship with grief, we can actually live a more meaningful and intentional life and have fun while we're doing it. I have so much fun with grief, even when it hurts, and even when there are a lot of tears, and it's uncomfortable and it's painful. And that's okay. In my mind, grief and gratitude go hand in hand. During our presentation, there will be a few opportunities to share thoughts and ideas that you have, because I believe that as we share our perspectives, we can all be inspired and then uplifted by each other. And this conference is an amazing example of that. So if you want to share your thoughts, just type your feedback, your answers, your questions in the comments, and then periodically throughout the session, and again at the end, we'll take time to go through what you're sharing. So like I said, in this speaker session, we're going to discuss reasons that people tend to avoid grief and how we can heal our relationship with grief so that we can start to paint grief in a more positive light. And then after that, I'll show you how you can take it a step further, and if you wish, personally apply what we've talked about today. So let's start off with a question. What comes to mind when you hear the word grief? Go ahead and put your answers in the comments. Loss of life, I hear a comment that it's overcoming the grief that's exciting. And I agree with that. The way I usually see how society paints grief is like the Grim Reaper, dressed in black, faceless, with a scythe, doom and gloom. We have another comment of homelessness. All of these things can bring grief. Loss of someone you love, health, etc. But grief doesn't have to be doom and gloom, although that's part of it. Grief is more than just dark, heavy, painful sadness. Grief is so much more. So, would you like to hear my honest answer of what I think of when I hear the word grief? Get ready, it's going to be exciting. Or maybe not. Anyways, when I think of the word grief, all of those things that you've shared come to mind. But usually those just fly right through my head. What really stays in my mind and in my soul when I hear the word grief are words like growth, adventure, gratitude, transformation, fun, laughter, play. And if you were in my workshop yesterday, you've already heard how I feel about grief, but it's such an important part of my subject today that I wanted to share it again. So I did my coaching training through the program Coaching End of Life. And our little group of 6 students met every day, Monday and Wednesday, every week, Monday and Wednesday morning at 4 a.m. So you're looking at somebody who wakes up at 4 in the morning twice a week for 2 hours? Yeah, twice a week for 2 hours at 4 in the morning to talk about grief, death, end of life. And I was excited about it. I couldn't wait to get up in the morning for class. And I did this for 10 months. When we first started and I saw the excitement on my instructor's face and heard the passion in his voice, I knew I was in the right place. On the very first day of our introductions, I said, "Hi, my name's Jenny and I love death." By the time I finished the program, my introduction was, "Hi, I'm Jenny and I love death." But I love grief. As you can tell, I'm super passionate about it. And I feel called to this work, so it makes it even better. But you know what? There were times, even towards the end of my training, that I doubted my ability, my purpose, my authenticity to do this work. A couple of years ago, I was preparing for a workshop to support people through Mother's Day, and a colleague asked me if I've ever lost a mother. I was crushed. I questioned my ability to relate to my clients and others who have experienced the pain of a loved one's death. Other times, I would compare my view of grief and death and feel like an alien trying to make sense of a foreign world. How can I help people who are hurting in grief if my outlook is so positive? Will I even be able to hold space for them in a compassionate and empathetic way? So instead of this energetic, passionate radiance of my smile when I first introduced myself, I walked around feeling confused, serious, hopeless. And if you're a coach, you probably noticed the shift in my tone and my energy just now. Even thinking it back on that experience, it brings all of that back into my emotions, my tone, my body language. It was such a dark time for me. Um, but then my therapist told me something that would change my life forever. And it changed not only my life, but my whole perspective of grief. And that perspective has been trickling through every conversation, every pause, every communication with every person I interact with. My relationship with grief has blossomed into a beautiful friendship. And yes, I did say friendship. And we have many amazing adventures together. Grief is my mentor, my guide, my companion, my playmate. I love grief. And it's not all tears and sadness. It's not uncommon for my husband to know when I'm working with a client or recording a podcast interview because my laughter fills the house. He has learned to be cautious when I'm finished because I bounce everywhere I go. And he also knows that I have to tell him everything about it so I don't burst with excitement. In fact, in my podcast, Share Your Story Exploring Humanity One Heart at a Time, one of my hallmark expressions are my happy squeals, and I'll probably be doing that in this presentation too. There's just so much goodness and laughter and insights, but words are too inadequate to convey my emotions. And just recently at a candlelight vigil, I shared my process of creating not just a relationship with grief, but a friendship with it. So the more I learn about and educate people on the subject of grief, the more excited I become. And that might be hard to believe because I'm already pretty excited. So excited beyond this gets me into hyper mode. um, so this and I also know how to rein it in. When people come to me with their tears, their trauma, their vulnerabilities, their hurt, their pain, I meet them where they are. I'm still excited about grief. I still love grief and I'm grateful for grief. And I know that not everybody's there. So sometimes there's space for tears and heaviness and silence. And sometimes there's space for positivity and excitement and laughter. My passion and my positivity rubs off on my clients. And people are often shocked when they hear that I work with grief. One person even asked, and people pay you for that? Yes, they do. In a meeting once, we were talking about how to deal with grief as coaches. And when I told them that my clients and I have a lot of fun in our sessions, one of the facilitators quizzically inquired, I want to hear more about that. So comments like these led me to create a transformational program called Converting Grief into Growth. This program helps people recognize, lean into, and build a positive relationship with grief in their own way. And I use experiences from my own life, what I've done, my processes. I use experiences from my clients, other grief workers, other people that I meet, experiences that I observe. I pull it all in to this program and give you everything that I have. And it's a one-to-one coaching program. And there's a lot of grief education that happens too. It's a journey, one to be embraced. Some of my clients have achieved amazing transformations in their lives. In fact, all of them have. In 6 months, my clients have gone from sitting on the couch, depressed and feeling bitterness and angry at everyone around them, to shining as beacons, embracing both their grief and their life with gratitude. Gratitude for the grief, gratitude for the connection with the person that they lost, gratitude for the journey, and even going beyond that, encouraging others to seek similar transformations. So, you may be wondering if you're in the right place at all. With my bouncy positivity, let's see if you are. Hold on. So if you're tired of running from your grief, if society's views of grief should be bleak, sound too bleak and absurd for you, if the light at the end of your tunnel seems impossible to reach, and you want to explore, is there even hope for me? You're in the right place. And also, if you feel like an alien and you want to find your people in grief, you're also in the right place. So today, I'm going to show you why so many of us avoid grief, how society contributes to that, and how you can reframe your grief and convert your grief journey into one of growth, gratitude, and transformation. And then at the end, because our time is really short today and I don't have time to share everything, and it's also not enough time to build a relationship with grief, I'm going to share as much as I can today, and then at the end, I'll show you a way that you can continue farther if you want to. So there are 3 main challenges that all of my clients and most people face when they're confronted with grief. The first challenge is the temptation to avoid the grief in the first place. The myths and stigmas society teaches us about grief and how to give yourself permission to grieve. Let's explore why people avoid grief in the first place. How many times have you been told, be strong, or don't cry? Ugh, I hate those words. I hate them. But often those are the first words that people say when they meet someone who is grieving. And while most of the time they're coming from a place of comfort and support, the message is neither comforting nor supportive. One reason why people rush in to comfort others in their grief is because of their own levels of discomfort with suffering. In society, grief is usually avoided at all costs. I'm not saying that grief shouldn't be avoided. In fact, in the early phases of the grief journey, following a loss, numbing the pain or staying so busy that you can't actually feel it can be quite healthy. Our bodies, and when I say bodies, I'm talking about all of the collective parts of our being that make us who we are, our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual aspects of our existence. So our bodies know how to grieve, and they know what they need. Sometimes at first, the loss and the accompanying grief experience is too much for us to handle. So we shut down, and that's actually a method of self-preservation. So I'd actually like to stop the slides for a minute, and we're going to do a guided meditation. So let's see. Okay. But before we do that guided meditation, we're going to take some participation comments. I see it's easier to avoid in the short term. Yes. What happens? Let me pull this slide back up again. What happens when we avoid the grief? I love this picture. It's for people in the younger generations, you may not know what a pressure cooker is, but it's a big pot that has a very tightly fitting lid. And if you boil something for too long without having the pressure valve on, or if the food is extremely soft, like noodles, the food ends up shooting out of the top all over your kitchen. Don't ask me how I know that. Well, it's from personal experience. Noodles and pressure cookers don't go together well. And the same goes with trying to stuff your grief and not deal with it. So let's go to that guided meditation. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment or look with a soft gaze at something in front of you. Imagine you are walking by a pond of stagnant water. What did it look like? What did it smell? Or how did it smell? There's probably some algae growing in the pond. Perhaps some leaves or twigs are floating on top. Maybe even some garbage. The water is dark and murky. You may even be trying to hold your breath because of how badly it smells. Think of all the bacteria and impurities that would be in that water. Would you want to drink that? Absolutely not. When grief is avoided or kept hidden, it festers until it finds its own way out, often through detrimental ways. Have you ever gotten really mad over something simple and insignificant? Maybe you've lashed out at your kids or a close friend. Unexpressed grief can lead to physical pain, mental fog, and spiritual depletion. How is that like the murky water? Grief is energy, and like water, it does best when it flows. So now think of a small mountain stream. Listen to the gentle gurgle as it flows over the rocks. Imagine how pure and clear the water looks. As you bend down and prepare to drink, you feel the coolness on your hands. When you raise your hands to your lips and taste the lack of chemicals and purifications. Feeling refreshed, you continue on your hike, grateful for the water's revitalizing power. How might this water be like our grief? If you have any thoughts or comments, go ahead and put them in the chat. Or you can just think about it on your own. Does that work better? Okay. Sorry. technical challenges thrown in the mix, and that can bring grief too. And it's all a learning experience. I have learned to meet grief where it is and invite it in, because I know that every time grief comes to visit, I'm going to learn something very, very valuable. So where did I drop off? I was probably, okay. So I was sharing a visualization. Let's close our eyes again and find that soft gaze. So we just pictured that murky, stagnant water. Now let's picture a small mountain stream. Listen to the gentle gurgle as it flows over the rocks. Imagine how pure and clear the water looks. As you bend down and prepare to drink, you feel the coolness on your hands. When you raise your hands up to your lips, you taste the lack of chemicals and purifications. Feeling refreshed, you continue on your hike, grateful for the water's revitalizing power. How might this water be like our grief? Go ahead and put your comments in the chat. For grief, for me, my grief is that flowing, pure, clear, cool water. And it's not something that I achieved overnight. It took me a while. So, what can we do when we feel stuck in our grief? How can we get our grief flowing like the mountain stream? Let's start the slides again. Can I have the slides pulled up? Our grief can feel like screaming into the void, yes. Like we're not heard or seen. We're invisible. Not too long after my colleague questioned me about losing a mom, I had another profound experience with grief. You see, things were actually going really well for me professionally. I was finishing up my coaching certifications. I was hosting events and workshops with the nonprofit organization Reimagine. I was working on finishing my required coaching hours. And I also have 5 kids. That's a lot to handle. Because some of my previous experiences, I knew that I was on the verge of sending my spinning plates crashing to the floor. So I reached out to my therapist. I could see the huge wave of grief coming straight towards me. And it was coming very, very quickly. So I texted him, "What do I do?" He texted me back, "Let it come." 3 simple words with such deep profoundness. Those words changed my life forever. And they changed how I looked at grief. In our textbook, Coaching at End of Life, a coach approach to ministering to the dying and the grieving, my coaching trainer Don Eisenhower writes, "We are typically taught that pain is an indication that something is wrong and that we should find ways to alleviate the pain. In grief, the opposite is true. The best thing one can do in grief is to open themselves to the presence of their pain. Crazy as it sounds, a grieving person's pain is the key that opens their heart and moves them forward on their way to healing. Staying busy may be helpful in short-term coping may be a helpful short-term coping mechanism by masking the pain. However, it merely postpones one's grieving. Clients and friends often tell me that the most helpful thing anyone has said in their grief is nothing. After an intimate yoga practice one time, the instructor shared that she felt like there was a war going on inside her and that she was bound by ropes and burning on fire. I sat behind her and whispered, "I've got your back." And as I held her in a strong embrace. Later she told me that that statement meant the world to her. Most of the time, people just want to know that they are loved, seen, and heard, that they're not screaming into the void. Our second challenge is deconstructing grief. As I talk to people about being a grief coach, we're dealing all the time with grief. And the main thing that we talk about is unlearning all of the myths and stigmas we've absorbed about grief. My husband's parents are in the process of rebuilding part of their house, and they just got finished with the demolition of the older segment that they'll be replacing. The pictures look very similar to this one. But in order to build their dream house, they have to first remove what was no longer serving them well. What are some of the destructive concepts of grief that you've been taught, seen, or experienced? Something to think about. As I talk to people about being a grief coach, I often hear responses like, I didn't know that about grief. One of my passions is educating people about the universal human experience of grief. If you were in my workshop, What to Do When You Don't Do Grief, yesterday, fantastic, you've heard some of these already. If you weren't, no worries. I'll actually be repeating that workshop on Saturday, May 7th at 9 a.m. Pacific time over Zoom. You can register for it by going to my website, grievingcoach.com, and clicking the events link. When you do that, you'll see my public portal for the organization Reimagine. You can scroll down to the upcoming events section, and there you can find the link to register for What to Do When You Don't Do Grief, as well as other upcoming events, including live podcast interviews when they happen. I do all of my events in collaboration with Reimagine, and they are so fantastic. So, here are some of the misconceptions that we often hear about grief. Grief is limited to the death of a close or immediate family member. Grief is actually the innate and natural response to any loss. It can come from the loss of a relationship, a job, a dream, expectations. Even the loss of a favorite restaurant can bring an intense grief reaction. Number 2, acceptance of the grief response is actually more healthy than avoiding them. Unfortunately, though, like we've talked about, grief in society is not often welcome. We're taught to comfort, fix, and avoid the messy. If, however, we embrace the pain and the messiness, we can forge deeper relationships with ourselves and with those around us. Number 3, grief is something that you can get over. Another phrase that I really dislike. Grieving is a process. It takes time. And even though the intensity and frequency of the grief reactions may decrease, grief will always be there. With time and work, though, it can be incorporated and even appreciated. But like a scar, it never goes away. Number 4, a grief response is more than just sadness. Emotions of grief can include denial, anger, confusion, regret, anxiety, fear, and even gratitude, love, and joy. And the grief response isn't limited to emotions. Grief can be expressed mentally and or physically as well. Grief affects the soul. It can manifest at all levels and in all parts of the being. Number 5, grief doesn't come only to the unlucky. Grief is universal. Everyone at one point in their life is affected by grief and loss. And when you are, it doesn't mean that you're weak or broken. It means you are you are a wonderful and an amazing human being, capable of experiencing a huge range of emotion, experience, and possibility. Number 6, everybody grieves in their own way. Just as every person is unique, the way an individual experiences and expresses their grief is unique. It's based on their personality, the nature of the loss, the relationship they have with who or what they lost, previous experiences with loss, and even their environment. Not everyone has a safe place to grieve. So if you're looking for a safe place, go to my website, grievingcoach.com, and schedule a free one-on-one coaching session with me. I'd be honored to hold that space for you. I'd be honored to hold your hurting heart in that space. And if you don't feel that vibe with me, fantastic. This conference is showing us there are so many people who are willing and ready and able to help people in their grief. So there's my website at the bottom. Thank you for that banner. The third challenge that we often face is knowing where to start. Where can we learn more about grief and get the help that we need? How can we start to build a relationship with grief? I'll give you some more concrete ways of how to do this at the end also. But for now, I'd like to share an experience I had with one of my clients. Earlier in my coaching career, I was working with one of my peers, whom I will call Kay for confidentiality purposes. Kay had experienced much trauma in her life: sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, human trafficking, unhealthy relationships, and even attempts at suicide. And yet she is the biggest cheerleader for others. Even in her suicide attempt, the method she chose was based on a compassion for those who would find her. Yet her life was a lonely one. She had no support system. As part of the requirements of our coaching program, we had to have a certain number of hours. And one way that we did that was by coaching each other. Kay and I agreed to peer coach each other, and in the process we became really, really good friends. And I always looked forward to meeting with her. I knew that no matter who was the coach and who was the client, I would learn a lot. In one particular session, I was the coach, and we were working through Kay's experiences of attempting suicide. As we unpacked it, she began to see how other events in her life led to being in that situation and perspective. At the end of our session, I encouraged her to continue exploring what was there. The next time that we met, Kay told me of an amazing miracle. Her vision had literally healed. She was wearing contacts, and all of a sudden they got really blurry. When she took them out, she could see with perfect clarity. Her eyesight was literally and physically cleared up. 20/20 vision. Later, she told me that she went through her life and reflected on her traumatic experiences one by one. She wrote them down and then thanked each one of them for the lessons they taught her. Not only did her physical perspective heal, her metaphorical vision improved as well. Kay was given a fresh start to her life. One way that we can start to build a relationship with grief is to reach out to others. A few years ago, I facilitated a panel discussion called Finding Hope After Suicide Loss. Near the end, one of my panelists, whose daughter died by suicide, emphasized, find a community to support you, who knows what you're going through, who understands, who really gets you, even if it's a community of one. In one of my Share Your Story podcast episodes, I interviewed Jessie A. Cruz, author of Losing Faith, Finding Hope, and Live Your Dash, Discovering the 8 F's to Freedom. In his book, Losing Faith, Finding Hope, he shares an experience when his newborn daughter was fighting for her life. While deep in his grief, a stranger came over, knelt down so he could look into Jessie's eyes, and offered some encouraging words. Jessie never forgot what that man did for him. At one point in Losing Faith, Finding, Jessie writes, "Hurt is a prerequisite to experiencing hope. We all need to help others recover, especially if we have experienced tremendous grief. If you keep suffering to yourself, you suffer more. If you help others with their suffering, they can begin healing, and so can you. Grief is not just a burden, it provides wisdom and empowerment. I believe that somewhere, someone is depending on you to share your pain with them. People need to see real life examples of people going from tragedy to triumph." During our podcast interview and the conversation we had leading up to it, I was amazed and inspired as he shared about the many lives that were touched by his daughter Faith. He said, "If my daughter, who could fit in a shoebox, can have such a huge impact on the world, how much more do I need to try to do the same?" In another Share Your Story episode, my guest was Robert Pardee, author of Chasing Life. the remarkable true story of love, joy, and achievement against all odds. He also wrote a Pimby tale, Adventures into Imagination. In our interview, he shared his story of being a caregiver for his wife through her journey and the death of metastatic breast cancer. One of my favorite and biggest takeaways from our conversation was the idea that grief offers us an invitation to redefine, reinvent, and recommit to the lives and futures we want to have. Going back to my experience with Kay, she cleared up her vision. And she did that because she took the time to actually look at and explore her grief. And when we do that, it gives us the opportunity to have a fresh start. After a loss, it's impossible to go back to the way things were. We have to find a new normal for ourselves and our lives. And sometimes this process can get really, really messy. This is what Kay said in a testimonial. Kay said, Jenny is an amazing, kind-hearted, loving, talented coach. The way that she is able to hold space for an individual is outstanding and only makes you shine even more. Jenny has coached me numerous times, and every single time I find out more and more about myself, always digging deeper and growing. Jenny follows me through my grief sessions, where I am often all over the place, and through my life sessions, where she is able to ask those deep, powerful questions I would have never thought of asking myself. She is quiet and allows me to speak, often finding solutions for myself, and helps me celebrate during those times. I love how she stays with me the whole time, never judging, and allows me to feel safe. Thank you. Thank you for always holding space for me, loving me, and treating me no different than before when I go into those dark places I often avoid or be judged by others. You amaze me. Highly recommend for grief or life coaching. And it's interesting, I actually talked with Kay today. She reached out a few days ago and asked for a grief session. And I told her, when? What's up? Today she got back to me and she said, I worked through it on my own. I'm better now. That's the power of grief coaching. It teaches you to work through your stuff, your grief, on your own. My hugest accomplishment is to be fired. When my clients say, I'm done, I'm good, I don't need you anymore. But if and when I do, I know where to find you. I want to conclude by reading one of my favorite poems. It's called The Guest House by Rumi. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. With that, I'd like to add a prayer and an invitation that we may each develop a more positive relationship with grief and treat him as an honored guest sent as a guide from beyond, bringing some new delight. If this is something that you'd like to explore further, as promised, I'm going to show you exactly how you can do that. I know I'm probably a minority in this one, but who here feels like grief is their friend? someone they're actually excited to see and spend time with. I know I had a grief bout uh, yesterday morning, in fact, and I knew that it was grief. I said, yes, there's my friend grief. And I did my grief. I did the painful part. And it was so painful that I didn't know how to get myself out too. I didn't know how to get myself out. So I called my support people. I called my coach. 5 minutes. And she gave me the techniques that I needed. But even in those 5 minutes, because of my relationship with grief, because of the time I've spent in recognizing and inviting my grief in, I knew what to do. As soon as I was grounded enough to do those things, I was good to go. And by, I think it only took me half an hour this time. I was laughing and in my element and in my passion and playfulness of grief. That's what we can do. That's what a relationship with grief can look like. The but if you're not there, that's okay. It's totally okay. It's okay to be where you are. If you want to get to that place of building a friendship with grief, there are 3 key elements that are necessary. One of those is validation. Another is acceptance. And the third is enlightenment. But without these, we may feel uncomfortable, lost, and even stuck in our grief. Some of us may feel okay with how we're handling our grief, but then we get told to suck it up and move on with our lives. With society continuing to teach us so many lies about grief, it can be hard to realign our perspective. When we're trying to sift through all the many shoulds, expectations, and falsehoods, our grief can be overwhelming. And I see in the comments, the self-punishment is uncomfortably fulfilling. Sometimes it takes a kick in the pants to help us realize, oh yeah, this isn't serving me anymore. This isn't where I want to be. But how many of us feel like a deer in the headlights when grief comes knocking at the door? Most, if not all of us, me included sometimes. Many of us try to avoid the pain for a good year after the loss, sometimes decades. The second year, so after the first year, that's a great time to avoid the pain. It allows your body to do what it needs to do because the pain is too much. And sometimes the second year isn't much better. In fact, often it's even worse because our support network has disappeared. Moreover, they expect us to be over our grief by now. When we're not, they bombard us with suggestions that may or may not actually be helpful for us in our individual grief journey. So again, the 3 key ingredients that will really help us make a difference in building a more positive relationship with grief are validation, acceptance, and enlightenment. There are plenty of people encouraging us to push grief away. What we need is someone to offer us a safe place to explore our grief and keep us going even though it's hard. We need help seeing things in a way we've never noticed before. We need someone to walk with us along the way, assuring us that we are right where we need to be, learning the lessons that will help us become the best version of ourselves. Since grief is a lonely journey when we're walking alone, I'd like to invite you to a free grief exploration session. This is a 50-minute private consultation where we'll look at where you've been, what you've been taught about grief, and how your experiences fit into those constructs or not. and what kind of relationship you'd like to have with grief. From there, we'll explore the tools and support necessary to get you there. In these one-on-one individual sessions, I guarantee that you will come away with at least one major takeaway in your life to help you feel a little bit more accepting and curious with your grief, so that you can actually start to see it as an honored guest in your life. I invite you to be open to the idea that you can appreciate grief, that your experience and expression is valid and perfect for you, that even those of you who support others in grief can learn something that will help you make their journey just a little bit less bumpy. This exploration call is an opportunity to get curious and build an even healthier relationship with grief. I'd like to share one last client story with you. This client's name is Jillian. Jillian recently guested on my podcast, Share Your Story, Exploring Humanity One Heart at a Time, where we showed how grief coaching has changed her life. You may have seen the episode during this conference. If not, you can always go to my website. Again, it's grievingcoach.com. It's running on the banner on the bottom of the screen. Click on the podcast link at the very bottom. Now, not all of my recorded interviews are officially published yet, so if you can't find a particular episode that you're looking for, just email me at jen@grievingcoach.com, and I'll send you the link to them. Or just keep checking back periodically. I update the podcasts and publish a new one at least monthly, usually twice a month. So, Jillian's sister found me on the internet just after their father died by suicide. In the podcast, Jillian shares that she was in a really, really dark place. Instead of her energetic and optimistic self, she was sitting on the couch crying all the time. She felt anger toward everyone and everything. She was bitter that her life was moving on, that their life was moving on, while hers was shattered into a million pieces. Knowing that she had to do something, she sent me an email asking for help. We set up a free introductory call over Zoom to explore her options. In the call, she felt really comfortable with me because she sensed how laid back I was. She even commented that she loved how I was in my garage with my kids coming in and out and insanity. By the end of the call, she decided that she would like to work with me, and we talked about the different options. She thought that she would need about 6 months of meeting once a month. Even by the first official session, we were laughing together as she shared fond memories of her dad. Now, not every session was sunshine and roses. There were sessions with a lot of tears as well. But regardless of how she showed up or what curveballs life had, she knew. Just going to check my audio real quick. Okay. Despite what curveballs life threw at her, she knew that she could bring all of it to the table, and we would talk about it and explore what was there. Just like my yoga instructor, she knew that I had her back and would be there to support her, even through the winter holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas. She knew she could reach out to me at any time. By the sixth appointment, just as she said, she was good to go. She had gained an appreciation for grief and all that it brought with it. She learned how to lean into grief, invite it in, and even enjoy its presence, because she knew that her grief time was a special time of reflection and connection with her dad. So I'd like to share the slides again. What makes my program, Converting Grief into Growth, so unique? Acknowledging the individuality of your grief journey, deconstructing unhelpful myths and stigmas, having a safe space to lean in to the grief, walking with a travel buddy, gaining new perspectives along the way, and my favorite, laughter. We focus on your individual style of grieving, not how society tells us we should. Trying to grieve in someone else's way doesn't even make sense. When I work with a client, I want you to feel safe and comfortable, bringing all of you to the table so that you can take this journey in the most natural and pleasant way possible. My clients tell me that I'm part travel buddy, part grief guide on the journey. I bring in the 3 key ingredients: validation, acceptance, and enlightenment. And these ingredients are tried, they are proven over and over to make the difference between staying stuck and converting grief into growth. So if you're ready for enlightenment, validation, and acceptance needed to build a positive relationship with grief, then I invite you to a free grief exploration session, the free introductory session that you can find on my website, grievingcoach.com. It's a 50-minute private consultation where we'll look at how you perceive grief, where you're at in your grief journey, and what support you need to get to where you want to go. And like I said, you'll walk away with at least one takeaway about how to bring a little more acceptance and curiosity into your grief. So on the slide, you'll see my contact information. You can go to my website and click on the link to schedule a free introductory session in my online calendar. Find a time that works for you. And if you can't find a time that works, just send me an email and we'll work something out. Also, if you have any questions or you just want to say hi and connect, send me an email. I respond to every day, check it every day, respond usually within 24 hours. Also on my website, you'll see an events link where you can see upcoming and past events that I've hosted in collaboration with the nonprofit organization Reimagine. I have 2 upcoming workshops: What to Do When You Don't Do Grief on Saturday, May 7th, and Managing Grief and Stress in the Workplace on May 14th. So I invite you to check those out, as well as past and future episodes of my Share Your Story podcast. Thank you all so much for coming and listening into my presentation, Benefits of Grief. I have one last request for you, and this is the way that I end every single one of my sessions with my clients. What are your takeaways from our time together? If any of you care to share in the comments, go ahead. If not, take it home with you and think about it. Use it for your own reflection, your own relationship, your own start to exploring grief and getting curious with it. Thank you again for joining me today. And a huge thank you to Tony Lynch and Josh, Nate, and Ian with Chicken Fox Production Studio. Have a fantastic night, evening, day, whatever time it is for you, and happy grieving. It's a journey, and it's a magnificent one.